What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird pilot. And I've flown Boeing 737s and Airbus A220s as an airline pilot for years. And today I want to break down something that has been building for weeks now. This idea that the US is about to strike a place called Pickaxe Mountain with B-2 stealth bombers. So my goal today is to walk you through what Pickaxe Mountain actually is, why it's such a difficult target, what a B-2 and the weapons it carries can and can't do against a site like this, what's confirmed versus what's still speculation. And then I'll give you my honest read as a pilot who has flown stealth adjacent missions and understands what this kind of operation actually looks like from the inside. So let's start with the basics. Pickaxe Mountain is the nickname given to a heavily fortified Iranian facility believed to be tied to Iran's nuclear program. It sits in mountainous terrain not far from the Natanz nuclear complex, which, if you remember, was one of the sites hit during the 2025 war between Israel, the US, and Iran. President Trump has publicly said multiple times now that the US will be striking this area, and he's used pretty blunt language about it, saying things like they'll be hitting it very soon and very heavily, and that there's not a thing Iran can do to stop it. Now, I always take public statements like that with a grain of salt, because sometimes that kind of talk is genuine signaling of an imminent operation, and sometimes it's a pressure tactic meant to push Iran back toward the negotiating table without actually pulling the trigger yet. As of right now, from everything I can find, this has been publicly threatened repeatedly, but I have not seen confirmation that an actual strike on Pickaxe Mountain has occurred yet. So I want to be upfront with you. This video is about a strike that has been announced and appears to be building toward happening, not one that's already confirmed to have taken place. If that changes, I'll do a follow-up video breaking down the aftermath. Now let's talk about why this particular site is such a big deal, because it's not just another bunker. Reports describe Pickaxe Mountain as being built directly into a mountain, with tunnels running somewhere in the range of 100 to 135 meters underground, so we're talking well over 300 feet of solid rock sitting on top of whatever is inside there. And it's not just depth that matters, it's what kind of rock. This mountain is described as igneous rock, mostly granite, which is about as tough a material as you're going to find for this kind of application. Iran didn't accidentally end up with a nuclear-adjacent facility under a granite mountain. This was very likely deliberately engineered that way, learning lessons from earlier strikes on facilities like Fordow to be about as resistant to conventional aerial bombardment as you can build something to be. For context, Fordow itself was already considered one of the hardest targets in the world, and it took B-2 bombers dropping specialized bunker buster munitions to do meaningful damage there during the 2025 operation. And even then, there were real questions about how much lasting damage was actually done versus how much Iran was able to reconstitute afterward. Pickaxe Mountain is reported to be even deeper and set in tougher rock than the mountains over Fordow. So when people talk about this being one of the most fortified nuclear facilities in the world, that's not just dramatic language. That appears to be a fairly accurate description based on what's been reported about its construction. So what would it actually take to hit a site like this? This is where the B-2 and a very specific weapon come into the conversation, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, often just called the MOP, or sometimes referred to by its designation, the GBU-57. This is publicly known information. It's been covered extensively in mainstream reporting, so I'm not revealing anything sensitive here, but I do want to explain it because I think it helps you understand the scale of what we're talking about. The MOP is one of the largest conventional bombs in the US arsenal, designed specifically to penetrate deeply buried and hardened targets before detonating, rather than exploding on impact at the surface. It's not really designed to flatten a building the way you'd picture a normal bomb working. It's designed to bury itself into the ground, or through layers of rock and concrete first, and then go off once it's deep inside the target, so the explosive energy gets directed at whatever structure is buried down there rather than just cratering the surface. The B-2 Spirit is the only aircraft in the US inventory currently certified to carry this weapon. And that's not a coincidence. It's the reason the B-2 keeps coming up every single time this topic gets discussed. The B-2 is a flying wing design. It has an extremely low radar cross-section, meaning it's built to be very difficult to detect and track on radar, and it has the payload capacity and range, especially with aerial refueling, to fly from bases in the continental United States all the way to a target like this and back, which is exactly what happened during the 2025 strikes on Fordow, when B-2s flew an extremely long round-trip mission from Missouri. That's an enormous logistical undertaking. We're talking many hours in the air, multiple aerial refuelings, and an enormous amount of coordination to make sure that bomber gets to the target completely undetected, does its job, and gets back out safely. Now here's the part that I think doesn't get explained enough in a lot of the coverage of this. Even with the MOP, even with the B-2, hitting a target like Pickaxe Mountain is not a guaranteed knockout blow. Analysts who've looked at this have pointed out that there's no guarantee the site would actually be destroyed, even using the military's most powerful conventional bunker buster. Depth and rock hardness both work against you here, and there's a real possibility that even a direct, well-executed strike does partial damage, seals off entrances, damages ventilation and power systems, maybe collapses some tunnel sections, without fully destroying whatever is deep inside. That's a really important thing to understand, because I think a lot of people hear B-2 bombers dropping bunker busters and picture some kind of guaranteed, complete destruction. And the reality with a target this deep and this hardened is much murkier than that. There's also been reporting on what Israeli intelligence believes is actually inside this facility right now. The claim is that centrifuges, the equipment used to enrich uranium, were moved into Pickaxe Mountain, potentially in violation of an earlier agreement that was supposed to keep Iran's nuclear program at a status quo level while a ceasefire held. Separately, other reporting suggests that as of right now, the site may not actually be in active use for enrichment, that it's functioning more as a storage location for equipment that hasn't been fully installed or activated yet. I want to flag that distinction because it matters a lot for both the military and the political conversation around this. If this is primarily a storage site for equipment that isn't yet operational, that's a very different target than an actively running enrichment facility. And it changes both the urgency of striking it and the potential consequences of doing so. And that brings me to something I think deserves real attention, which is the question of what happens if a facility like this does contain enriched material and it gets struck. This has been discussed in public reporting. So again, I'm not getting into anything sensitive here, just relaying what's already been covered. But the concern raised is that if there is highly enriched material stored inside and a strike disperses it, you could be looking at contamination risk in the surrounding area, similar in concept to concerns raised around a dirty bomb scenario, where the danger isn't necessarily a nuclear detonation, but the scattering of radioactive material. Experts have pointed out that this is one of the reasons any decision to strike a site like this gets weighed so carefully at the highest levels, because you're not just thinking about whether you destroyed the target, you're thinking about what happens to the surrounding environment and population if that material doesn't stay contained. Let's talk for a minute about what an actual mission like this would look like operationally, because I think this is where my background is actually useful to you. A strike like this is never just a couple of B-2s showing up and dropping bombs. Analysts have described what a real operation would likely require, starting with a serious suppression of Iranian air defenses in the surrounding region, essentially clearing a path through the air so that the strike package can get in and out without being engaged. That means electronic warfare aircraft jamming radar and communications, potentially other strike aircraft taking out surface to air missile sites and radar installations ahead of time, tankers positioned to refuel everybody involved, and search and rescue assets on standby in case something goes wrong. The B-2s themselves would be flying an incredibly long mission profile, and every part of that flight, from the moment they leave their home base to the moment they're back on the ground, has to be planned with an enormous amount of precision, because a stealth bomber's entire advantage is built around not being detected, and any breakdown in that plan puts a multi-billion-dollar aircraft and its crew at serious risk. I also want to point out, because I think it's an important piece of context, that Iran has apparently designed this site specifically anticipating this kind of attack. If the reporting is accurate, that this facility was built after and in response to lessons learned from the Fordow strikes, that tells you Iran has had real engineers thinking specifically about how to survive a MOP strike from a B-2. That's a genuinely difficult problem for target planners on the American side, because you're not hitting a surprised, undefended target. You're hitting something that was purpose-built to withstand exactly the weapon you're most likely to use against it. That doesn't mean it can't be hit effectively, but it does mean the margin for error and the amount of precision required goes up significantly compared to a strike on a less prepared target. Now let's talk about the broader picture here, because Pickaxe Mountain doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of this much larger, ongoing conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran that's been running on and off since early this year. There was a ceasefire-type agreement reached back in the middle of this year that was supposed to keep Iran's nuclear program at a fixed status quo level, no further advancement, in exchange for a halt in strikes. If it's true that Iran has been moving equipment into Pickaxe Mountain since then, that would represent a pretty direct violation of that understanding. And that's part of why you're seeing this specific site come up over and over again in the president's public statements. It's being framed as evidence that Iran hasn't actually held up its end of that agreement. On the other side, Iran has continued to insist, as it has throughout this entire conflict, that its nuclear program is not aimed at building a weapon. And Iranian officials have talked about Pickaxe Mountain in terms of national pride, calling it one of the most fortified facilities in the world, which is its own kind of signal, because that's not really the language you use about something you're embarrassed to have. So here's my honest opinion on all of this. as someone who spent years flying combat missions and understands both the technical side of an operation like this and what it takes psychologically and operationally to execute a high-stakes, long-range strike mission. I think the B-2 and MOP combination genuinely is the most credible tool the US has for a facility like this. There isn't a better option sitting in the inventory right now for going after something buried this deep in this kind of rock. But I also think anybody expecting a clean, one-and-done result is probably going to be disappointed, because the physics of hitting something over 300 feet deep in granite just don't guarantee total destruction, even with the biggest conventional bomb we've got. My honest read is that if this strike happens, the most likely outcome is significant damage. Entrances sealed, internal systems wrecked, maybe partial structural collapse in sections, but real uncertainty about whether everything inside was actually destroyed versus just buried and inaccessible for now, which is not the same thing as gone forever. I also think it's worth being honest that a strike like this, even if it goes exactly as planned from a pure execution standpoint, doesn't necessarily end this conflict. It's more likely to be another escalation point in what has already been a long back-and-forth war with pauses and restarts. Iran has shown throughout this conflict that its response to being hit tends to be retaliation against regional targets, rather than simply standing down. So if Pickaxe Mountain does get struck, I would expect to see renewed attacks against US and Allied positions across the Gulf in the days that follow, the same pattern we've already seen play out after previous strikes earlier in this war. I want to say something here too about the air crews who would actually fly a mission like this, because I don't think that gets talked about enough. Flying a B-2 on a mission like this means being airborne for the better part of a day, in a two-person crew, executing an incredibly complex, high-consequence mission where absolute precision timing with tankers, with support aircraft, and with the target itself all has to line up perfectly. There's an enormous amount of trust placed in those crews and an enormous amount of pressure on them, knowing that the entire success of a mission this politically and strategically significant rests on their execution. Having flown combat missions myself, even in a very different context, I have a lot of respect for what that actually demands, both the flying skill and the mental discipline to execute something like that under that level of scrutiny. Let me also touch on something that I think gets lost in a lot of the more sensational coverage of this story, which is the uncertainty around whether this strike even happens the way it's currently being described. Public threats from political leadership don't always translate directly into military action on the announced timeline. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the threat itself is the point, meant to pressure the other side back to a negotiating table, or to reassure a domestic audience that action is being taken. I'm not saying that's definitely what's happening here. I genuinely don't know. That's above my ability to assess from where I sit, but I do think it's important for you to hold that uncertainty rather than assuming a strike is guaranteed just because it's been publicly announced multiple times. So where does this leave us? I think Pickaxe Mountain is a legitimately significant, difficult target, built specifically to survive the kind of weapon most likely to be used against it, sitting at the center of a very real and ongoing dispute over whether Iran has honored an agreement about its nuclear program. I think the B-2 and the Massive Ordnance Penetrator represent the most credible option the US has for addressing that target, but I don't think anyone should expect a guaranteed, total destruction outcome even if that mission is flown. And I think whatever happens with this specific site is going to be one more chapter in a conflict that has already shown a repeated pattern of strikes, retaliation, brief pauses, and renewed escalation, rather than some kind of single decisive final blow that ends things outright. I'll keep you guys updated as this develops, because if this strike does happen, or if we get more confirmed details about what's actually stored inside that mountain, that's absolutely something I want to break down for you in as much detail as I can, the same way I try to do with everything on this channel. What do you guys think? Do you think this strike actually happens on the timeline that's being talked about? Or do you think this ends up being more pressure and signaling than an actual imminent operation? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this helped you understand what's actually going on with this story, go ahead and hit that like button for me, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the follow-up when there's more confirmed information, and follow me on X and Instagram where I'm posting updates on this pretty much daily as it develops, links in the description below. And go ahead and check out the video right here. I think you'll enjoy it. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.